Okay, we're just going to let the participants are flowing in right now. Once we get to around 300, we'll start up, John. Okay, might take a minute or two. Welcome everybody. I think you're all sort of filing into the Zoom tasting right now. We're going to give it a minute or so to make sure that everybody who signed up has a chance to join. So if you bear with us a minute or so and give everybody a chance to log on, we'll be starting up really quickly here. So I'd say once we get over that 300 mark of participants, we'll get going. So we're getting really close, everybody. Thanks again for your patience. All right, we're at 298, so I think that's close enough. We're gonna get going. Everybody, good morning from California. My name's David Amadea. I'm the president of Ridge, and it'll be my great pleasure to host today's tasting. I'm coming to you from my house, from my dining room in the Santa Cruz Mountains. So like most of you, I'm working from home right now, but thank you for joining us today. And welcome to Ridge Vineyard Spring 2020 virtual tasting. We've been conducting these virtual tastings for around 8 years now, but this is the first time we've used the Zoom format. It's the first time that we're not all shoulder to shoulder behind a table in front of a beautiful vineyard. So this is a little bit different for us, but obviously these aren't normal times for anyone right now. So we'll just give you a quick update about what's happening here at Ridge Vineyards. We've been very fortunate. None of our employees, none of our staff has been diagnosed with the virus. So that's been a blessing. And as a virtual business, as an essential business, we've been able to operate in the vineyards pretty much per normal, both at Montebello and up in Sonoma County. Our two wineries, Montebello and at Lytton Springs, also have been able to operate pretty much per normal. So with normal barrel racking and topping operations and even some bottling going on right now. So that's been positive. Our administrative staff, for the most part, is now working remotely from home, and that's also gone amazingly well. And our business is plugging along. Clearly, we're suffering from the closure of restaurants, as all of you are suffering from that as well. And the closure of our two tasting rooms has been a burden, but we've come up with some really creative ideas to try to compensate for that closure. So that's been a great challenge for our staff, and the adaptation and the innovation has been really remarkable to see. A little Zoom housekeeping for you. So if you look at the bottom bar of Zoom, there's a Q&A, and we'd like to use that for questions for our panel. So if you have specific questions for our production team, please put them through there. If you just want to chat with other members or other people on the broadcast, you can use the chat function. We'll also be moderating the chat function as well. So if there's any questions that come through there, we have staff looking at that as well. So we really encourage your questions, and we really look forward to them. So please don't hesitate if anything comes up to use the Q&A function. So now I'd like to introduce our panel. So in my upper left-hand corner is Eric Baher. Eric's our Montebello winemaker and chief operating officer of the Montebello Winery, and Eric's been with Ridge for 26 years. So certainly fully competent to answer all your questions today. So we're glad to have Eric on board. In my upper right-hand corner is David Gates. David is our Senior VP of Vineyard Operations, and David is in charge of the Montebello Vineyard, all of our vineyards up in Sonoma County, as well as all of our outside growers. And David has been with Ridge for 31 years. So there again, I think he's pretty qualified to answer your questions this morning. So thank you for joining us, David. And John Olney, who is our winemaker and head of our Lytton Springs winery in Healdsburg. And John is joining us from the winery today. And John has been with Ridge for 24 years. So in total, 81 years of experience with these three gentlemen. So yeah, they're all very old. But thank you for all joining us today, and we appreciate it. So the wine's in tasting order, and I know not all of you have been able to have access to these, but for those of you who do, hopefully they're poured out in front of you. And the order today is the 18 Estate Chardonnay, 18 Three Valleys, 18 Paso Zinfandel, 18 East Bend Zinfandel, the 18 Geyser Ville, and then lastly, the 2017 Estate Cabernet. So let's kick it off with the 18 Estate Chardonnay. And Eric, since that was made right where you're sitting today, why don't you kick us off on that wine?
Yeah. So this comes right from the cellar right below me down. I'm in the old Montebello winery built about 130 years ago. Dug into the hillside. We've got these really cool limestone rock wall cellars where the Chardonnay production is carried out. So this Chardonnay is all grown here on the Montebello property. Most of the blocks are just kind of at the fog line and below. So they're on the north and northeast exposure, the coolest spots of the mountain. And with that fog that we get from the San Francisco Bay, we'll have really cool nights, and that really helps preserve the acidity in the fruit. It's generally a pretty long growing season here. So we're generally harvesting our Chardonnay in kind of September, mid-September. Some years it even actually goes out into October, which is a pretty long season. But with that coolness, it really helps moderate the ripeness and again, preserve the acidity so we can make a really classic style Chardonnay that's not typical what you find of California Chardonnay. So 2018 was kind of a drier year. So we had the floods in 17, we had the mega drought 5 years before that. And then we came to 18, which kind of returned to a drier year. But luckily that summer remained fairly cool. And also some of the spring rain that we got kind of helped get the vines out to harvest without too much water stress. We didn't have much of a crop that year, but then with the cooler condition, it really allowed the grapes to get beautiful ripeness. And, we weren't under any pressure of grapes ripening faster than we could pick. So as blocks were deemed ready to pick by taste, we were able to bring the fruit in. It's all hand-picked. It's all steep slopes. So, we only pick a certain amount in the morning. As soon as the sun's up, David and his team's out there harvesting, and we'll bring the bins up to the winery and load the clusters into the press and gently extract, barrel down that juice the next day, and just await the natural yeast fermentation. So that generally takes about 4 months to finish. In 2018, I think most of the lots were kind of going dry by February. That's then when we top up all the barrels and begin doing a lot of barrel stirring, throughout the next phase of the winemaking, which is the malolactic. That's all natural. That takes time, especially given the acidity we have. It can really slow down and inhibit the malolactic getting started. But we've got a pretty strong malolactic bacteria here. I mean, they've adapted to this high acid that we have both in the Chardonnay and in the Cabernet. And so they always seem to go through. So in 2018, most of the malolactic was done by July, and that's when we were able to sit down and taste through all the cubes and really put together this assemblage. And what we're after in the estate bottling is really bringing together lots that have really good fruit display, forward, accessible, elegant, nice oily texture to the palate. And so we're kind of tasting through all the different cubes, and over the years I've been really working the Chardonnay in more of a way like a perfumist. You're really playing around with all the different aromatics that arise from natural yeast fermentations and the different oaks that we use. I mean, it's predominantly American oak, but we've got different forests, we've got different toast levels to work with. A lot of the barrels are even older so that they're not impacting the wine with so much oak character. So I kind of taste through all the different groups of barrels and really piece this together and build upon the aromatics from the different barrels that are chosen. And then once it's assembled, it goes back to barrel. It spends another 4 or 5 months in oak, And at that point, it's all about gravity clarification. So as we approach bottling date, we can do a clean rack and go directly to bottle with no filtration. And that way, I mean, with Chardonnay being on the more delicate side, you really don't want to touch the wine with any processing. You really want to be able to capture all the beautiful quality of fruit and the wonderful texture and get it to the bottle. So we got this bottled in early December. We kind of time our bottling dates around the moon phase of when the elliptic orbit of the moon, when the moon is coming close to the earth, you've got that extra gravitational pull. You start to see it actually affect the tides in the San Francisco Bay, where they go really strongly negative. And so that's kind of where we'll do our clean rack, is when we've got that negative tide, and also the weather. So if there's any storms that blow through, you can see sudden swing of barometric pressure. And that's just enough to cause the lead to lift off the bottom of the barrel. So if we get storms during that time, we just have to hold off on bottling. So some years, the bottling date of the Chardonnay, it can move depending on what kind of weather is happening in December, January, February. But this year it worked out well. I mean, we got it right to bottle. It's beautifully clear.
Yeah.
And it's just got an incredible aroma. I mean, we're fortunate to have limestone here on the mountains, so that really gives this wine some additional minerality. And then the fog, that comes in, also brings with it, some of the sea salt. And so you get even a bit of a saline quality to our Chardonnay, which I love.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks, Eric.
Yeah.
And David Gates, so, until with the release of the Grenache Blanc last year, this has been the only white wine Ridge has made. And can you talk a little bit about when we first made Chardonnay for Montebello, and also, how many acres are currently planted on the vineyard site?
Yes. Let's see. For the Chardonnay, for many, many years, our Chardonnay was kind of one of our best kept secrets. We've been making it ever since Ridge was bonded in 1962. And that has, that's a long history of working with Chardonnay in the Santa Cruz Mountains. And we currently have about 28 acres planted to Chardonnay up and down the mountain. So our lowest elevation Chardonnay, as Eric said, kind of sits in the fog line at 14, 15, and 1,600 feet. And then we have some more Chardonnay, kind of mid-elevation, about 18 to 2,000 feet. And then we have a little bit up on top at the Peroni Vineyard, which is 2,650 feet at the very top. So we have it kind of scattered around, and we've also had some issues on our lower vineyards with Pierce's disease, which is a bacterial disease of grapevines that hits Chardonnay really hard, and it's vectored by an insect. Here in the Santa Cruz Mountains, it's a blue-green sharpshooter. Other parts of the country have other more nasty insects, or a nasty insect that can transmit it long distances. It's basically why you couldn't for many years grow vinifera in the southwest of the United States, or even in the East Coast, because of Pierce's disease. And so we're fighting that with a unique product that was just registered last year for California, and it's a bacterial phage. So we're injecting that into the vines, and we're seeing if it's going to help.
That's great. A couple of winemaking questions, Eric. One is the Chardonnay made anaerobically, and also, is there any fining of the Chardonnay?
No fining. And winemaking, it's actually a bit oxidative at the start. So after we press and collect the juice, we let it sit in a tank overnight. There's no protection. We don't put any heavy inner gas on the juice. We don't add sulfur. We really want to promote the browning reaction, which helps knock out some of the unstable color molecules. And so the next day we'll pump the juice over, we'll aerate it, and then barrel it down. And then once it's in barrel, then it kind of goes into reductive. Just that's what natural fermentation will lead to. And we'll let it ferment. gradually in that cellar below ground, it stays at pretty much earth temperature. So it doesn't really move much above 59 Fahrenheit. And so the yeast at that lower temperature will ferment really slow. And, you know, by the 4th month is when the sugars are pretty much consumed. That's when we top up barrels and then begin doing the lees stirring. So doing a lot of batonnage, which kind of helps prevent some of the reduction that develops, you know. But I do time the stirs around, trying to get a little bit of reductive character, which I love. You know, just a slight hint of a yeasty kind of, it's almost like a toasty element.
And given that we use only wild yeast during ferments, there's questions about stuck fermentations, Eric, and do they occur very often, and how do we handle them when they do occur?
Yeah, luckily not at all. I mean, I've been doing this for quite a long time with Chardonnay. I've never had it stick. I mean, with reds, sometimes, you know, it could be a little problem here or there, but usually the natural yeast will figure a way out to ferment to dryness. It may not happen immediately in the primary fermenter, but after pressing off, and if you're on good lee, there's enough nutrients and ambient yeast left there to finish it off maybe a month after pressing off. But everything will go dry. And really, Chardonnay is probably the easiest, you know, as far as primary ferment. Now, malolactic can be a little bit more troublesome, but we've never inoculated. Again, we've got a really good strain, a house strain here that has adapted to the high acid condition.
That's awesome. Thanks, Eric.
Yeah.
We're getting lots of questions, and I apologize if we don't get to all of them because we want to get through all the wines. And we will answer them in writing if we don't get to them live. But one last question, because I thought it was really interesting question, David Gates, before we move to the second wine was, but does injecting Faraj into the vines make it no longer organic? That's an interesting question.
No, it's certified. It's a natural product. The bacteriophage, or if you consider them a living organism, which there's a big debate on that, but they are the most numerous organism in the world. They're everywhere. And yes, it is. It's certified organic. It doesn't hurt. Doesn't change the organic status.
Okay, great. Good question. Good answer. Thanks. So let's move to the second wine. This wine is unique in our lineup and unique in all the wines we make. The Three Valleys is the only multi-vineyard blend we make. It's not a single vineyard wine. So it's much more of a winemaker's wine, and John and Eric make this wine together. So John, maybe I'll ask you to kick it off and talk a little bit about the 18 Three Valleys, what you see in the wine, and what the 18 vintage was like in making this particular Three Valleys.
Sure. So good morning, everyone, or good afternoon. So the Three Valleys, like David mentioned, it's a product of really the overarching philosophy of how we make wine at Ridge, which is through the selection process. So in any given vintage, be it Geyser Ville, be it Lytton Springs, we have all the individual parcels that make up the vineyard, which we bring in as they get ripe. We ferment them separately. And then after malolactic, we go through and really select out the ones that we think typify the vineyard in that given year the most and have the most intensity to them. So all the others, if you will, sort of the B lots, which are perfectly good, but just don't have that definition that we're looking for in that year, those are the ones that we blend together to make the Three Valleys. And Paul always used to like to call it our winemaker's wine, because this is one where, rather than relying just on the specific vineyard to express what the wine's all about, here we're blending. It's really a blending process. We're going to bring in a little bit of this, a little bit of that. 2018 was a vintage that fortunately had a really nice rate to it. It sort of just went nice and slow and even. So it was easier for us to sort of keep everything separate, take a long look at it, and assemble the wine over a fairly, long period of time. Having said that, I think it's one of the most, probably one of the richest, most intense Three Valleys we've made. I mean, really, you know, you taste it up against the lineup of some of our single vineyards. I think it you know, gives it a run for its money.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for that, John. The other thing that Paul has always said also, and I think Three Valleys really epitomizes this as much as any wine we make, is that if you want to have a great first wine, you have to have a great second wine.
Yeah.
And Lytton and Geyser Ville are great first wines, but having Three Valleys and allowing us to have a wine to declassify fruit to keeps those wines great, but it also provides a huge value to clients and customers with the Three Valleys, because this is, you know, this wine is, you know, maybe 60-70% from the Lytton and Geyser Ville vineyards, single barrel handled, natural yeast ferments. It's made like the rest of our wines, but in a blend. So it's you know, it's a great value, and it really is it's a big part of what we do at Ridge, and it's the largest production wine we have also. So it's a key component to what we do. And Eric, the Three Valleys, what are the Three Valleys the wine is named after? People always ask.
It's kind of our three favorite Appalachia or sub-appellations of Sonoma County. So Dry Creek Valley, where our Lytton Springs property is located, you know, it's kind of the sweet spot. It's really the most wonderful microclimate for Zinfandel to grow. And so, you know, we've got, you know, again, 60% of this wine is coming from that valley. And then right to the east of that is the Alexander Valley, where we have our Geyser Ville property. And then to the south, we've got the Russian River Valley. So those are all within like 5-mile radius of each other. And, you know, it's probably the absolute best microregions for growing Zinfandel and getting really wonderful quality. And that's where, you know, the bulk of all our single vineyard Zinfandels come from. Even the little tiny lots that we sell right here at the tasting room, we're sourcing from these old vineyards.
So talk a little bit. I mean, people I think are curious about how the wine is made. Like you're at Montebello, John is at Lytton Springs and Healdsburg, and you're trading lots back and forth and putting a blend together. How does that process work?
Well, you know, we're first beginning the harvest, getting through the harvest, fermenting everything in small batches. So John's busy with all the Lytton lots and, you know, the Ponzo and all the various Zinfandels from up there. I get Geyser Ville down here and a couple, you know, other vineyards in the Alexander Valley. And so we're working through, we get finished with harvest, we make our single vineyard wines, and then we kind of look at what's left. And there's still a selection process beyond the Three Valleys. So if there's some lot that came along that just didn't really have, you know, much intensity or richness, you know, we get rid of that. That goes out on a, you know, tanker truck to another winery sold in the bulk. So we really look at the rest of everything that we didn't use for the single vineyard wines and do a bunch of tasting over several months, really seeing, you know, getting together, getting all our lots together, tasting through. There's always Carignan, Petit Syrah, Mataro, Alicante, some of the really traditional blending grapes that are left over that we can also include in small percentages. And so we can sit there and control the destiny of this wine by seeing what's left over and then seeing, you know, small additions as we're working the blend to kind of steer this wine towards having great fruit appeal, beautiful balance. You know, it's not going to be a long-lived wine like Lytton, Geyser Ville, which are going to improve over, you know, 25 years in the bottle. This is something that we want to be able to go to bottle, release, and it's going to be drinkable. And it's just a wonderful wine to experience.
Awesome. I guess the last thing I'd say about this wine from a commercial perspective is the 18 was a good size harvest, and we have a good size Three Valleys that we're releasing right now to market. And the 19 is also a good size vintage and a good size Three Valleys. So we have nice continuity of this wine. And I think maybe in the current environment where people are drinking more frequently at home, looking more for everyday wines, I think the Three Valleys has maybe a growing importance in our portfolio right now, given the environment we're operating in right now. So
yeah, it's a good lead-in wine too to the Ridge portfolio. You know, to start off with something this wonderful for that price, and then as you've got more curiosity to all the other wines, then you can start going, you know, venturing into Paso, East Bench, Geyser Ville, Lytton.
Yeah, the first rung of the ladder, but that's why this wine's important also, because more often than not, this is the first wine from Ridge people will try. So it has to be darn good for us to make sure that they continue their adventure in Ridge and continue to try the rest of our wines.
Well, and it will always be, because I mean, we sit there and we can really control the assemblage, and then we always line up previous vintages of this same wine to really make sure that the character and style is continuous.
Yeah.
So we can really make sure that it's really going to have a wonderful quality to it.
Great.
And then in winemaking, I mean, we're treating it no different than Lytton Geyser. I mean, it's all barrel aged. It's getting racked every 3 months. You know, it's really following the same path as everything else.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, good. All right. Thanks, Eric. Let's move to the third wine, which is the 2018 Paso Robles. I think of note, Benito Ducey, who had farmed this vineyard since he was a teenager, passed away within the last year, which was sad. And maybe, David, you want to talk a little bit about Benito and his contributions. And, you know, we've been working with him in that vineyard since the mid-1960s. So it was a very long history with Benito.
Yeah, Benny was a sweetheart. He grew up on the ranch there and really never left it, except to serve a few years in the Korean War, or just after the Korean War. The Ducey family is kind of an institution now in Paso Robles, and Benito's parents had settled in the San Luis Obispo area, and they were kind of innkeepers, restaurateurs. So they actually bought this vineyard in the middle of the Depression, in the middle of before the Depression, but in the middle of Prohibition. Yeah, 1924, and they bought it. It was already planted. The vines were young, and they had a couple of restaurants where they were, I guess, you know, serving a little bit of wine under the table. Anyway, yeah, like I say, Benny never left. His nephew, Mike Ducey, and Mike's family have kind of taken over, and we've had a really good relationship with them, and it's been great. With Benny, he would always, I mean, he knew that vineyard like the back of his hand. And so, but he always wanted to have his hand held at harvest and to decide when to kind of pick the grapes. So that was it was a great treat. It was really a privilege to get to know him and work with him for the 30 years. So yeah, it's a beautiful vineyard, absolutely beautiful vineyard.
So David, can you talk a little bit more about the vineyard itself and why it's such a unique site?
Well, it's getting pushed out. It's very close. So across the street, which is the street actually is there's a Ramada Drive, and then there's 101. So that's kind of the street that it's across. I used to be rolling hills and farmland, and now it's a big shopping center. He's got a cement plant on one side, the river to the east, and then a mixed-use commercial zone to the south. So he's pretty hemmed in. The fact that he kept those vines going is great, and it's so the Paso Robles area is known for this kind of middle-aged, 40 million year old or so limestone series in the hills, especially on the west end. Well, Benny's vineyard is right along that a river that has washed out all that soil, so it's alluvial soil, but it's filled with limestone, and which gives decent acidity for those Zin vineyards in a hot spot. If you look at Paso Robles as an Appellation viticultural area, it's been broken up into a bunch of different AVAs, and his is right in the Templeton Gap. So that's important because it does get hot there, but in the Templeton Gap has some fog that comes up over the hills from San Luis Obispo and actually cools down the vineyard often at night. So it doesn't mean that it won't get super hot during the day, but it will cool down. And yeah, they're the vines and the photo, nice little bush vines planted 10 feet apart, and they were own rooted in 1922 when they were planted. And so over the last 40 plus years, there's been some phylloxera that has moved into the vineyard. So Benny would pull out maybe 100 or 50 to 100 vines a year. And that started like 40 plus years ago. And so original vines, there are maybe 5 or so acres left of that 20-acre vineyard. But the replant vines on resistant rootstock, he's trained up just like they trained the old vines. So they look the same, nice low heads. You can see that in this picture. And he just adds a spur a year as the vines age out. And Mike is, like, his nephew's doing a great job.
Great. Eric, these are usually some of the first vines that come into the winery from Paso. What did you see in 2018 with the Ducey Ranch?
Yeah, I mean, just as usual, first fruit to come into the winery. It's generally late August that we're harvesting there, and our thing is to get in early. Start sampling the grapes right after veraison and really getting a feel for taste and ripeness, and get the fruit off the vines before it goes too far. And because it is such a dry and arid environment down there, as soon as grapes are ripe, you have to move quickly. So it's usually all picked within, 4 or 5 days. Luckily it ripens most uniformly there. There's one spot below Benny's house in this canyon and swell that often takes a couple more weeks, but the bulk of the vineyard will all come off very quickly, comes into the winery, and because we haven't really crushed anything else, it goes right to our favorite Zinfandel fermenters, where we can do submerged cap fermentation and then work the skins. And with submerged cap fermentation, while you're not pumping over, you're still getting some nice, slow, gentle extraction. So it really helps fill out the wine. And because this is just pure Zin, you don't have any additional color coming in from Petit Syrah. You don't get any additional richness from Carignan or any of the other blending grapes. And so to really make this wine a little bit more structured and full body, you have to kind of work the skins harder. So we were in the fermenters for about 2 weeks in the 2018 vintage. So that's pretty lengthy fermentation, but that really helped build some good structure into this year's Paso. And because of the limestone that David mentioned in the soil, I mean, it almost acts like Geyser Ville. So even in a warm region, you would not expect Zin to hold its acid. This is one site that does. It came in with some beautiful acidity numbers. So it really has created a really exotic Zinfandel in the glass. It's just, almost explosive fruit and then juicy acid.
Yeah, it's gorgeous. It's a beautiful wine. Well, that's a good transition to you, John, in terms of the next wine is another 100% Zinfandel that we make, but from Dry Creek and Estate Vineyard, the East Bench. So maybe talk a little bit about the 18 East Bench and maybe contrast it with the Paso, because it is interesting to try the wine side by side.
Yeah, sure. So, obviously we're changing locations is the first thing. This is a single vineyard wine from Dry Creek Valley, Appellation. It's actually right next to our Lytton Springs vineyard. It's a 20-acre vineyard, which we planted in 1999 and also a little bit in 2000. And the first about 6 or 7 years, the young vines, went into the Three Valleys, and then we started making it as a single vineyard wine in the 2006 vintage. And, I think that, there's some similarities, like Eric was mentioning. One of the great things about this site is that, despite it being 100% Zin and also being, in a fairly warm, it's actually not quite as hot as it is in Paso, but retaining acidity can be a challenge. And yet this is a wine that, especially as the vines get older, really has just great natural acidity. It's one of the really neat things about the vineyard is, as the name suggests, it's up on the bench, so up above the valley, looking out towards the east. And the soil, the topography is very, very even. So you really get this nice, consistent ripening and consistency in the overall quality of the fruit. The only other challenge, of course, to that is that the uniformity being all Zin, it gets ripe all at once. And since we are, at Ridge, we're trying to make wines that are balanced overall, and certainly for Zinfandel, one of the key elements to that is getting the grapes when they're ripe but not overripe, because we're really not looking to make the wines that are 15-16% alcohol, which we feel tend to be a bit out of balance. So that's the challenge with East Bench. But in 2018, I think we had a really, really great success. The yields were a little lower, bit more concentration to it, and I think it has that really opulent upfront fruit that you get from Zinfandel, similar to the Paso. I think a little bit of the difference that I see is there's a little darker fruit in the East Bench, maybe a bit more structured tannin. I think that both wines age well, but certainly the Paso is really the one that out of the gate really, really impresses in terms of the aroma, just the fruit expression, whereas the East Bench is great young, but I think it kind of improves and changes and evolves over even the first 3 to 4 years.
Yeah, it is. It's fun to try these wines side by side. The Paso is a little richer, a little sweeter fruit, a little more accessible right now in its youth. The East Bench, more structure. I think the higher acidity in the East Bench brings out that structure too, and it's a little more of a serious wine than the Paso right now.
Yeah.
But great, they really do perfectly show off their terroir and their appellations, though, don't they?
Yeah, they do. I mean, the importance of having the Paso is that, historically with all the Zins, mostly for Ridge in the early days, was coming from Sonoma County. And, those wines were always really solid and structure. And the Paso at least was a Zin that had more fruit. It was softer in tannins. It was kind of, before we made Three Valleys, I mean, it was kind of the entry point into Ridge Zin if you wanted something that was nice and fruity and drinkable.
Absolutely. Well, good. All right. Thanks, John, for taking us through that wine. Let's move to the Geyser Ville 2018. So after trying 200% Zins, we're now going to a field blend. And David Gates, maybe you can tell us a little bit about the Geyser Ville Vineyard, which is probably in a lot of people's assessment, one of the top Zinfandel vineyards or mixed black vineyards in the world, and what makes it so unique.
Well, a couple things, David. One is that we've been making this wine since 1966, so it's a pre-Paul Draper wine. Dave Bennion made the first few vintages, and then Paul took over, and I think that longevity and that history really adds to the mystique of this wine. It's in the Alexander Valley, just south of the town of Geyser Ville, not far from our Lytton Springs winery, but in some different soil. So the soil here is gravelly. It's called Pleasanton Fine Gravelly Loam. So it's basically Russian River alluvium, lots of river rock in it. The deeper you get into the soil, the more rock there is, but it's all river rock. It's all very young soil, so 1 to 2 million years old. The vines here, there's a little remnant vineyard called the Old Patch. It's 6 acres of mixed Carignan, Zinfandel, Teinturier varieties, Mataro, you name it. There are, I believe, about 23 different varieties planted in there. Some of them only single vines and some of them very obscure, but beautiful. And I think that's kind of the heart of this wine. In addition to that, there's some equally old Carignan blocks that we are able to source in with it. And we have also then planted, starting in 1990, well, I should back it up. There's some 55-year-old Zinfandel blocks that go into this blend as well that add depth. And then they're starting in 1990, we were able to lease this property and did some planting. So we did our 3 favorite selections of Zinfandel, along with some Petite Sirah and some Mataro, and those vines have been added into it. And then in 2000, we were able to plant a little kind of makeshift, or sorry, not makeshift, replica Old Patch. We call it the New Patch, where it's where we scattered different varieties across the block, including Zinfandel, Carignan, and Petit Syrah, along with some other ones, and that's been very successful too.
So Eric, can you talk a little bit about the 18 Geyser Ville, and then, you know, what do the other components outside of Zinfandel bring to this wine? The Carignan, the Petit Syrah, the Mataro. What complexity and elements do they bring to the Geyser Ville in particular?
Yeah, well, I mean, 18 again was just that drier year following the wet year 17. 18 came along, you know, drier, giving us a little more concentration. But luckily, summer being cooler, it all uniformly ripened. Harvest started mid-September, continued into October. We have 25 different areas that we pick in the ranch. So we start off with some of the 1990s planting younger Zinfandel. And then we kind of go into the 1964 plot, and then gradually into Old Patch, the Old Carignan. And so as things are coming in, we're working each fermenter, getting good extraction. What I love about 18's the quality of tannins. I mean, they're really fine, really supple. They're really surrounded by great fruit. And, you know, a lot of the magic of the blend, though, is the pieces that we bring together. So we generally start, the heart of the blend is with the Zinfandel that comes from the 1990 and 1964 plantings. And then we bring in Old Patch. That's really the infusion of really deep complexity. So the Old Patch is a co-ferment of those 23 different grapes. So within it, you've got a lot of Carignan, Petit Syrah, Mataro, Alicante, and they infuse color. You know, Carignan especially, that's a grape that has a really strong kind of black cherry quality of fruit. It's high acid, so it really brings in some firmer acidity to the blend. It really livens up the palate. The Petit Syrah brings in the structure, the spice, color, and then of course Alicante Boucher being a Tenturia, it's full pigment. I mean, it just brings in deep, rich color. So in the co-ferment, it's this crazy alchemy. You've got fusion of color and all these molecules from all the contributing varieties working with Zinfandel. So it's like a stew, and it's just sitting there cooking. And when you press off, it's this black juice that's just so rich. And so you bring that into the blend to join the Zin. And then we have three separate blocks of 100-year-old Carignan that are fermented separately. And again, those are really fantastic. And most years, I can bring all of that into the blend. And so this year, we have a total of 20% Carignan. You know, so all three blocks join the mix, plus what came in from the Old Patch block. So it's a healthy amount of Carignan. And what I love, again, about Carignan is the plush tannins. It really kind of broadens out the palate, gives it an elegance and really nice firm acid. And then we've got 10% Petit Syrah. So that's also a good amount. You know, that gives this wine a lot of definition and structure. You know, we've been making Geyser Ville now for 53 years. This is our 53rd bottling. And you can just see that wine can age for decades. You know, it requires patience when it's young. Although, I mean, our thing is, you know, we want to make wine that's got good balance. So coming out of the fermenter, each of those lots, we're not going to try to over extract tannin and make a wine that's really tough and undrinkable when it's young. We really want it to be sensuous and really wonderfully balanced. And then as we're doing our assemblage, we're picking and choosing carefully to bring the very best lots together that really have a strong vineyard character showing. And then barreling it down, taking care of the wine, getting it to bottle, and then just seeing how the vintage really ages. So this one here, I'm kind of figuring, you know, it's going to drink really well over the next 12 years, but it will definitely go far beyond that. I mean, you can still open up bottles of, you know, some of the 60s, like 68 is still very drinkable today.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a remarkable vineyard. Like you said, Eric, we've been working with it for more than 5 decades, but the oldest vines planted in the 1880s. So clearly the oldest vines we work with and some of the oldest vines in California. And clearly they've survived the Spanish flu, the First World War,
Yeah.
Prohibition, World War II. So there clearly is some amazing quality there for these vines still to be in the ground today.
Yeah, especially Prohibition. That was a time when people were ripping out vineyards. So, I mean, this vineyard survived. It had been producing such great quality before Prohibition that they were able to keep that vineyard going. There was enough demand for those grapes by home winemakers to keep it up and running.
Keep it going.
Yeah.
Yeah. John, do you want to talk, there's questions about our use of American oak, and let's specifically talk about American oak use with our Zinfandels. And I mean, it's certainly not the only thing winemakers do in California. A lot of winemakers use French oak on Zinfandel, but you know, why do we choose American oak, and what type of oak do we use, and do we use bourbon barrels? So there's some curiosity about our oak regime relative to our Zinfandels.
Sure. Well, I think first, Ridge's use of American oak has a long history, and I think it was really Paul Draper who sort of forged that our kind of alliance with American oak. And in speaking with Paul, one of the interesting things is obviously, Ridge started by making Montebello, so we were starting off with the Bordeaux varietals, and there's a tendency, I think, in any new world situation to compare yourself to the old world, and a lot of people were, really trying to make wines that would compete with the best Bordeaux's. And certainly in the late 60s and throughout the 70s, when Paul joined Ridge, a lot of people in California were just opting for French oak sort of out of default without really even tasting the wines, because they wanted to make something that had the same aroma profile as Latour or Lafite or Mouton. And Paul was very adamant that Montebello had the terroir to express itself. It didn't need to be sort of dressed up with French oak, but he tasted through a number of oaks, not just American, not just French, but oak from Yugoslavia at the time, oak from many different forests throughout Europe, and he really saw a good marriage with American oak, and initially with Montebello, and then later with Zinfandel. So that's really, I think, how it started. And then over the many decades, we've developed relationships with Coopers that really allows us to get wood which is forest specific. For example, we can request certain forests from Minnesota, from Missouri, from the Appalachia states. And, and another thing which I think has also really enhanced the overall quality of the cooperage in the United States is that many of the French coopers have actually moved over to the United States and set up shop. So that's also brought their expertise, and I think especially in the selection process of how you choose oak, because obviously choosing oak that you're going to make a bourbon barrel with is a very different process than one in which you want to have oak that's much more refined, that's aged much longer, which is toasted much less aggressively for wine.
Yeah. And I mean, Zinfandel, a very fruit-driven grape and a fruit-driven wine. How does that interact with French oak versus how a Zinfandel interacts with American oak?
Well, I think that American oak can really add this sort of a very sweet and almost like a coconut quality. Some would describe it as. So I think that you have to be, like you said, because Zinfandel, its sort of calling card is this beautiful expression of fruit. I think you have to be a little more careful, whether it's French oak or American oak, but probably even more so with American oak, in my opinion, in terms of just how much new oak you use. We usually limit it from 15 to 20%. Yeah. Whereas, and Eric could comment in terms of our regime with Montebello, where you have a whole different terroir, you have a whole different set of grape varietals that can absorb 100% American oak. So I think you have to be very, very cognizant of the raw material, so to speak, that you're working with.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and it kind of comes down to you really want the wine to express its vineyard character first, and then its varietal mix. You don't want the cooperage being the very first aroma and taste you feel in the wine. I mean, we're about making wines of place, not trying to show off the artistry of barrel making, which, if you're using a lot of new oak, I mean, with Zinfandel being a little bit more delicate, it will easily become over oaked. So we always watch the percentage of how much new oak is brought in every year. We hold on to our barrels for about 5 to 6 years and kind of spread the wines across that. And at every rack, as we're moving off the lead to clean the wine up, we recombine all the different aged barrels, and we can taste and see, okay, how's the oak? Is it integrating? If it's a little too heavy, well, then we can send the wine back into older barrels. Or if we want a little bit more oak influence to add texture, we could go into a little bit more new oak. So there's always refinement along the way as we get to bottle.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a bit of a deep dive into the oak regime, but I think it's really interesting, and I think it's an important discussion for people to hear. So why don't we move to our last wine, which is Bordeaux varieties, Cabernet based, different vintage, 2017.
Montebello.
Yeah, so this is our little baby Montebello here, the 17 Estate Cab. Eric, maybe you want to kick that off.
Yeah, so the vineyard in total is made up of roughly 45 plots of the Bordeaux varieties that start off at 1,300 feet, that go up to just about 2,700 feet. We've got mostly Cabernet Sauvignon in the ground. We've got Merlot as a second grape, Petit Verdot, Franc. We're fermenting all these areas separately, and that actually, those 45 blocks, the way this mountain is not flat at all. I mean, we've got slopes, we've got different exposures. We have to basically fragment up every parcel and go in and separate out high vigor from low vigor. So the most stressed sites tend to make Montebello. The sites where there's a little bit more water resource to the vine, the berries are going to be a little bit juicier. The phenolics aren't going to be quite there to make a 50-year aging Cabernet. So we strategically go through and pick out the blocks and harvest, over about a 5-week period of time. And, in the fermenter, we can really watch the extraction. So we're treating the wine basically the same as Montebello. It's just in the fermenter, we can recognize there's certain spots on the mountain where...
So Eric, I think we have a lot of static on the line. Maybe you want to try muting your microphone. I'm not sure if it's you, but let's give that a go.
Okay.
Oh, it stopped. So somebody...
Oh, okay. Is it better?
Now we have buzzing.
Oh. Yeah? Let me see.
David, can I ask you to mute yours? Okay, it's gone away for now. Eric, can you hear me?
Okay. Yeah, I can hear. You can hear me?
Okay, now you're muted. I can't hear you, so I'm sorry. Maybe we'll move over to David Gates. And David, maybe if you unmute yourself, and hopefully we can hear you.
Hello.
No, I can't hear you either.
Oh, no. I can hear everyone.
John, maybe I can hear you.
Oh, no.
Let's see.
No, David, you can't hear me?
Okay, I can hear you now. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I can hear everyone.
Okay, good.
Good.
So sorry about that, everyone, for the technical difficulty.
Yeah.
Maybe, David, let's talk about the terroir at Montebello a little bit. I mean, the most well-known areas for growing Cabernet in the world are Bordeaux and Napa, but you have this one little oddity called Montebello that it's a bit of a fly in the ointment. So what makes Montebello unique as an area to grow Bordeaux varieties, and what makes it distinctive from Napa and also from Bordeaux?
Well, so the first thing is it's a mountain. It's up in the hills, as we've talked about. 90% of the Cabernet grown in Napa is in valley floor, whether it's Napa Valley proper, or Childs Valley, or Woodin Valley, or Pope Valley. It's all, you know, it's mostly valley. We don't have anything that resembles a valley at Montebello. I joke that anything under 10 or 15% slope is considered flat at Montebello. The other thing that makes it unique is its situation in the South Bay. So we are inland mountains, so we're facing inland on the Santa Cruz Mountains, facing the bay and not facing the ocean. We still get plenty of ocean influence, but we also get influence from the bay. So the South Bay, as the South Bay heats up, it brings in that inversion layer that you see in this picture in the middle of the summer towards harvest, where there's like a sea of fog that sits at about 1,700 feet at the top, maybe a little lower sometimes. And that is really important for us because, especially in the Cabernet and Merlot vines that are above that fog, in that the nights are a little bit warmer and the days are cooler than what you find in valley situations. So that helps the vines mature physiologically without going super high in sugar. And that's the one reason why we can actually get Cabernet Sauvignon ripe at Montebello, because climatically we're in a pretty cool spot. And then the last thing that is very different about Montebello is the limestone that we have. And it's limestone and greenstone mixed together, and it's called an exotic foreign terrain in geologic terms. So it was formed in another era, in another tectonic plate actually, and was kind of stuck onto the North American plate by the seismic activity with the Pacific plate pushing the Farallon plate underneath the North American plate. So we are, you know, we're pegged onto the North American plate, so we're part of the North American plate, but it's the actual ground was formed 140 million years ago in a sea south of the equator by volcanic and oceanic influences. So the other thing that's kind of cool is we're right on the fault. So we're just to the east of it, but that is really mixed things up with all over the eons as it's pulled apart, pushed together, moved north, moved south. It's really blended in a lot of other elements into the soil. So all that makes it very unique.
Yeah. So, I mean, we have a very long growing season at Montebello. So typically harvesting in October. Now, Napa is also oftentimes harvesting in October as well. But 32 years ago, before coming to Montebello, you worked for a while in the Napa Valley. So just that raw fruit, if you're tasting Napa Valley Cabernet picked in early October versus Montebello picked in October, what are the flavor differences in the fruit at that point?
Well, as you pointed out earlier, I'm old. So when I was in Napa, I probably fully, maybe half of the Cabernet vineyards, they were just starting to do a big replant from the AXR replant. So the vineyards that were still producing were all older vineyards, and they had a bit of virus to them. So they were actually not accumulating sugar as fast as the newer plantings that started kind of late 70s, early 80s, when flux was just kind of moving in, and it wasn't until the early 80s that it really started to really attack AXR vineyards, and that's when they started to do replanting with different rootstock and clean wood. So the sugar accumulation difference between an old virus vineyard in Oakville versus a new close-spaced vineyard, Cabernet vineyard in Oakville is night and day. It's maybe even a 3 weeks to a month difference in accumulation. But flavor-wise, you have to, if sugar is accumulating too fast in Cabernet, the tannins, well, if you do good canopy management, the tannins aren't going to be green. You're not going to get a lot of the kind of herbal flavors from it if you do the right canopy management, but the tannins can still be very hard and very tough. And so one of the tricks to combat that, and it's been used now for quite a few years is to just, they call it hang time, right? You just let the grapes get very, very ripe. And what that does is it changes the structure of the skin anthocyanins and tannins, and they become easier to extract and softer on the palate. So at Montebello, if we did the same amount of extraction in our grapes as you can do in Napa, the wine wouldn't be drinkable, in my opinion. It would be super tannic. So we extract differently, a lot quicker and probably a lot less extraction because there's so much more. And the grapes aren't as overripe, I would say.
So Eric, we're getting close to the end here, but I mean, I think the question people always ask about the estate Cabernet is, how is it different from Montebello? I mean, price-wise, it's a quarter of the price.
Yeah, a quarter of the price.
But what is the real difference between the estate and the Montebello?
Well, again, it comes down to where on the mountain the fruit is coming from. So in a high vigor spot where the vines have better water resources, the berries are going to be a little bit juicier. The fruit quality is going to be a little bit more forward. So as those come into the winery, we're going to handle them different. So we're not going to try to over extract them and make them into Montebello only to be declassified. We're really from the very beginning in winemaking, making this wine to be drinkable, to be a version of the Montebello that's going to have good fruit, softer tannins, at release, you can drink it and enjoy it, whereas the Montebello itself needs like a good 10 years of bottle age before it's even ready to drink. It's going to improve over that time and get even better. This is the cab you can drink in that period of time that you're waiting for Montebello.
Yeah, it's very fascinating. So unlike in Bordeaux, where the second wine is more linked to vine age, really at Montebello, it's linked to elevation and soil depth and some other factors.
Yeah, so just because of how this mountain was pushed up and just the different, you've got the cracks through the rock and you've got springs and you've got water feeding some vines, and then up the slope you got more stress. So, that stress section goes to Montebello. The lower section will go to the estate cab. So it's all about proximity on the mountain and where things come from. And we're still blending in Merlot. We still have Franc. We've got other things to work with, because again, we're growing all these different plots on different points of the mountain. So we always have some Merlot to include for blending, which helps round out the tannins. We've got Petit Verdot for a little bit darker fruit, Franc for the aromatics. That's so we could still blend it like Montebello, where we've got great complexity coming to it. It's really about the size of tannins. We want those to be more kind of refined and more polished, and so that this is a wine that can be really enjoyed on the young side. We even give it about 6 additional months of barrel age past Montebello, where the longer it stays in oak, the more resolved the tannins can be. So we can really go to bottle with something that's going to go right to the market and be really drinkable and enjoyable, which luckily we got in the 17 vintage here. After the 5 years of drought, we got the rains, the vines kind of rejoiced, and they had finally water to work with.
Yeah, that's fabulous. It's a great wine and really enjoying it. So now I've got a lot of open wine here. So I think, I'm going to share with my quarantine neighbors probably bottles now, because I don't think I can drink all of them in the next few days, but I'll make my neighbors happy. But thanks to the panel today. Thank you, David Gates. Yeah. Thank you for your time. John Olney, thank you for joining us today. We really appreciate your time. And Eric, thanks for joining us as well. And many thanks to our audience for sitting through the tasting and the discussion. We appreciated all the questions and interest. And we'll look forward to seeing you in the fall on September 18th, hopefully under different circumstances than today, for our fall virtual tasting. And just wishing all of you and your families health through this crisis. And hopefully everyone is going to do great and come out the other side stronger than before. So thanks again, everybody. And thanks for joining us for the virtual tasting.
Thank you.
Everybody.
Cheers.